Welcome to Stories of Transformation, an NRCDV radio podcast production. This is episode 3 of our Inspirational Women series, highlighting the life experiences of advocates in the field of gender equity and social justice. I am Yvonne Ortiz, and today's guest is Lynn Rosenthal, a consultant working to inspire action to end gender-based violence. We will be discussing her journey through a life of activism around women's and anti-violence issues. Stay tuned to hear about the path that brought Lynn from local coalition building to the White House. Welcome to our show, Lynn. Before we start, I just wanted to tell you, I met you around 10 years ago, and you were doing a plenary session, and I was listening to you speak, and your energy and your passion for the work was such a great inspiration. I mean, it was amazing. It's one of those times that you feel energized, and you go out with new ideas, and I want to thank you for that. As advocates, we continually need that energy from those that are doing the work, at the level that you are. So it's great to have you here, and I'm so happy that we get to learn a little bit more about you. So let's get started. What was your dream job as a young girl, and why?
Well, it's kind of funny. My dream job as a young girl was to be a baseball umpire. Because I used to go, I didn't play, but I went to a lot. My father coached and my brothers played, and so I was always at the baseball park. And the umpires seemed to me to have this really great role of the person who got to decide what was fair or not. And I also liked the idea of proving that a girl could learn all the rules. So I used to have these little discussions with my father and his coach friends about a certain call and was it right or wrong. And so I like to think at that time when I was about 9 years old that I could hold my own in those conversations.
Wonderful. Can you name a person who has had a tremendous impact on your life? It could be, maybe somebody that has been a mentor to you, a family member, and why and how did this person impact your life?
I have to say Congresswoman Donna Edwards, who was the executive director of the National Network to End Domestic Violence before I came on board. And Donna was, first of all, the smartest person I've ever met and a really brilliant lawyer and policymaker. And Donna really understood how to get things done in Washington, D.C., and she understood how to get things done without selling your soul. And she always made sure that we analyzed policy with an eye towards our long-term goals. And so she recruited me to come to NRCDV when she was leaving. And then, of course, she went on to have a great career as a member of Congress. And I know we haven't heard the last of her. But what she did for me was make me feel like this was something I could do, that I could come to Washington, D.C., and that I could lobby in Congress, and that I could follow in her shoes, and that I could make a difference from that policy perspective. So she's just a tremendous hero, I think, to many of us.
Yes, I completely agree that she's an inspiration to be the first African-American woman to represent Maryland in the United States Congress, and then after that to co-found the National Network to End Domestic Violence. She is definitely an inspiration. And let me tell you, you are also an inspiration to so many as well. Can you share a life experience that really defined your personal path?
So I didn't grow up in the battered women's movement or the anti-violence movement. I was working in reproductive rights, and that's what I wanted to do. I graduated from college with just a bachelor's degree in social work, and I really had focused on grassroots organizing and community organizing. And so I worked in women's health care. And I worked in clinics where we provided reproductive health services. And I saw a lot of women coming into the clinic with injuries, but I didn't really understand what I was seeing. I really didn't know anything about domestic violence. I didn't come from a home where there was violence. And so I didn't really know what this was. And then I was asked to speak at a rally. I was asked by the local shelter in my community to speak at a rally that was being held on behalf of women who are in prison for killing their abusive partners. And I was asked to speak because I was the head of this women's health clinic, and they were trying to build a strong coalition on behalf of these women that were seeking clemency. And the project had actually been started by women themselves who were behind bars, who started organizing and agitating for a process that eventually the governor in Florida set up to evaluate their cases for clemency. So I was asked to speak at this rally, and I wanted to understand it. So I started reading the women's stories, and I was just so stunned that so many women were in prison at that time. There were 300 women in Florida's prisons for killing abusive partners. Those were just the ones the project knew about. And I just couldn't believe these women's stories. They'd been so badly abused. They'd suffered so much. They tried to save their life or the life of their children. And here they were, in many cases, had very lengthy prison sentences. So it really affected me. And when I was asked to come work at the shelter, I went. I said, this is the work I want to do. This is really liberation. This is really about women's freedom and power, freedom from abuse and violence. And so I went to work at the shelter, and when I was being trained on sort of the dynamics of domestic violence, and I saw the tactics of abuse and power and control and intimidation and coercion, I suddenly understood, I understood all the women I'd been seeing in my health clinic over all those years who had injuries and who couldn't take their medications and who couldn't do what they needed to do for their health. I suddenly understood what those women had been experiencing, but I also understood myself better because I was finally able to have a language for an abusive relationship that I was in when I was 19 years old. I dropped out of college. It really derailed me for my 20s, but I never had a language for it. I didn't know what had happened. We didn't use the words dating violence at that time. I was a college student. I wouldn't have called myself a battered woman. But all of the elements of power and control and intimidation and physical and sexual and emotional abuse were present in that relationship, but I never knew what it was. So when I had that training and I learned about the dynamics of abuse, I suddenly had an understanding of an experience that had occurred in my life and why it had been so difficult for me to get back on my feet. So I would say that really transformed me and helped me understand the work in a much deeper way.
You've done a wonderful work, at a local level, at a national level. What can you think the one thing that has been the most significant challenge you have encountered while doing this work?
Certainly going to work in the White House because, I never worked for the federal government before. I was an advocate. I'd come from the grassroots. I was a survivor. And so I really didn't have the broad-based skill set that a lot of people who were working at that high level of policy had. And I knew as advocates, I did the work the way we often do, which is reacting to challenges or threats to our work. And so I knew how to do that. I knew how to react when there was going to be a policy that was going to hurt survivors or when I felt like there were threats to funding. I knew how to react. And I knew how to mobilize people to react, but I really didn't know how to be proactive and how to use institutional power to help set policy. I didn't really know how to do that. And so I had to learn that, in the White House. And I tell the funny story, my whole first year, I was sure I was going to be fired at any time because I couldn't quite get to what needed to happen. And so I'd come home every day and say, I'm going to be fired. And people would say, no, Vice President Biden has a lot of faith in you, and he knows that you're doing your best. And indeed, as I was able to spend more time in the White House and I spent more time with the vice president, and I asked him these questions, like, how do you use institutional power to make a difference? How do we change culture? How do we really change society? And so I was able to learn from him, and I'm obviously was honored that he had the faith in me and that he really helped me understand how we could use the power of the federal government and federal agencies to actually make a real difference in people's lives. And so I'm honored that I had the opportunity to work at that level and to learn how to think much bigger I tell the story sometimes of how I went to a budget meeting. I was called to a meeting with the president's budget folks, and I was asked to bring information on violence against women. So I brought in our little chart that many of us have that lists all the VAWA grant programs and how much we fund for legal services or transitional housing or victim services. And I thought that was my job, was to go in and go over this chart. And when I got in the meeting, I realized that people were thinking in a much bigger way. If we really invested in a social problem, what kinds of results could we see? If we invested, say, in early childhood education, how would that change the trajectory of somebody's life going forward? How would that change our communities? So that was the discussion people were having in the president's budget office. And it wasn't about my little chart. As important as those programs are, it was really about how do you invest in a social problem to make a difference? So I had to learn to think in a much bigger way.
Yeah, and I just want you to know that while you were in those meetings, you had advocates like me. You know, we were down here and we were saying, "Oh my God, Lynn Rosenthal is up there," and you gave us so much hope. It was just the day that I heard that you were in the White House. It was just, and I'm sure many other advocates felt the same way.
Well, thank you, but I have to say that it was you all that gave me hope, because that first difficult year when I was on that learning curve, and it's intimidating to walk through those doors and feel like you carry a burden of using this short period of time to make a difference, but it was you all. Like, I always felt I was carrying all of you in with me, and I would actually had a visualization where I imagined all the advocates and survivors I'd met over the years, like, walking through the White House doors with me. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So, Lynn, I know that you carry many, many stories in your heart. How are you able to continue doing the work without burning out, and how do you take care of yourself?
Well, I have to say, again, that this was really difficult in the White House, and it's not what you would expect, because I wasn't doing direct services or direct work in systems, but when I was working in the White House, the vice president asked me to meet with a group of parents who had lost daughters, whose daughters had been killed in dating violence relationships. And over those years, we met with many, many parents who came in to advise us of what had happened to them and what recommendations they had as a result of what had happened to their daughters. And again, I really turned to Vice President Biden, because he had such a way of comforting people and of helping people work through their grief and helping people feel like something was going to come from the terrible grief they were experiencing, having lost their children. So I learned a lot from that. And also, there's so many great stories of how women, how people go through this experience of having survived violence to becoming an activist to really creating change in their communities. And I find those stories really inspiring. I think it works in that way. And, when people have experienced something like abuse or violence or other forms of trauma, many people really want to take that experience and make a difference as a result. So that inspires me, and I've learned a lot about taking care of myself recently because I'm part of Move to End Violence, and in that program we really focus on how do you take care of yourself for the long haul, and what is it that brings you joy in your life. And so I try to, I have every spring I grow a big vegetable garden, and I can spend hours out there, and I feel so close to life, to the life force in my garden. So that's something that I do. I have lots of animals in my household that bring me a lot of joy. So, but also dear friends. I think that the best thing we can do to care for ourselves is keep connections with people who share our heart and our passion.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. So what would you say, or what advice would you give to a new advocate, somebody that is just new to the violence against women work?
I would say learn as much as you can, listen to as many people as you can, hear lots of different perspectives, know that you have new answers in yourself, and that you learn from the past, and then you move it forward into the future. And so as you're gathering all this information, we also want to be thinking, well, what's next? What contribution can I make to this work? What's my perspective? How might I see things differently? And to trust that we need to learn from the past, and we also need the perspectives of people who are moving into the future, and to trust that. I sometimes hear from new advocates that it is kind of intimidating, and that they don't always know, can they speak up in a meeting if there's a lot of people in the room with more experience. And I would say, yes, speak up in that meeting. The anti-violence movement started by very young women who took a great leap and put themselves out there and engaged with social justice movements and engaged with communities. And so that's what it takes. So I don't think anybody should ever feel like they're too young or they don't have enough experience to reach out and to make change.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. In your opinion, what will be the biggest challenge for the generation of advocates coming after you?
Well, I think more than a challenge is this great opportunity now to bring the movement back to its social justice roots, and particularly through the lens of race and gender together, and having a more expanded analysis of the work. It really started there. The early activists were talking about race and gender together, that we had to end all oppressions, racism and sexism and all of it together. Somewhere along the line we kind of lost our way. And so I think it's an opportunity now to create this intersectional analysis that engages communities in new ways of thinking about ending violence. So I think it's a great opportunity right now. It's challenging time, certainly, politically, and there are many threats, but reaching beyond that to what kind of world do we want to live in and how do we get there, that's exciting, I think, for young activists.
Mm-hmm. Great. Lynn, what is your legacy, or what would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I don't think any of us have an individual legacy. It's collective, without a doubt. I mean, when I think about all of the accomplishments in this movement and what's still to come, I think it's a collective experience. So I don't know that any one person carries a legacy. I think some of the things I've done. One is really to support young women. So I look now, so there's sort of a generation of leaders in their late 30s and early 40s, and those were my people that I worked with when they were in their 20s. And I watch them now, and I'm amazed by people like Karma Kottman, who I've known for 20 years and started out as an intern and now is leading a national project and is so brilliant. And I listen to her speak, and she's taken it so far beyond anything she learned from me, but I feel proud that I had a part in her development. And there's many others. Allison Randall, who's the Chief of Staff at the Office of Violence Against Women, who I worked with for many years and really tried to support her development. So I think part of my accomplishments, I don't know if I'd say legacy, but lives in them, and I'm proud to see them work. And then there was a lot of work that went on in federal agencies during the Obama years that I was part of that is embedded in those agencies. One example is the work we did on HIV/AIDS and violence against women and trauma as a driver of HIV/AIDS in women. And that work is embedded at the staff level in federal agencies. And much of that probably nobody ever heard about. A lot of that kind of work is very behind the scenes. A lot of the work we did on housing programs to try to make them more accessible to survivors of violence. A lot of the work that we did on programs like home visiting to make sure that home visitors understood domestic violence and were able to work with families. A lot of that work is known by the people in those federal agencies that are carrying it out, and I think that work will continue. I think that the work we did on violence against women under President Obama and Vice President Biden created institutional change, some of which certainly could be undone, but much of which I think will continue, whether we know it is or not. I think that it will.
Mm-hmm. On this International Women's Day, is there a woman you would like to honor?
Yes, I would like to honor Farah Tanis, who many people know. She's head of Black Women's Blueprint, and she's just an astounding leader and activist, and she's creating change from the ground up. She's mobilizing communities. She's speaking out. She's created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to compile Black women's stories of sexual violence from slavery to today. She's visionary and an amazing leader and a mobilizer, and I want to honor her on this International Women's Day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Lynn. You are truly an inspiration, and know that at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, we have been, following you. Every little thing that you've done, we try to lift it up so that our advocates know what's been done in the movement. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You just listened to Stories of Transformation, an NRCDV radio podcast production. Thank you to today's guest, Lynn Rosenthal. She truly is an inspirational woman. To hear more NRCDV podcasts or to access additional resources on gender-based violence and related topics, visit www.nrcdv.org. NRCDV radio podcasts are brought to you by the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and supported by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau.